Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And we have a Q&A episode for you guys today. So we'll try to get through 2, maybe 3 of these. But as you guys know, we can ramble on certain topics. So we'll see how far we get. But the first question comes from Billy.Rolls on Instagram. And it says, quick question. I'd be interested in here to learn your thoughts on your standpoint on noise reduction software. Do you use it, and how are the results once a photo is blown up large for printing?
So I would say the answer to do I use it is yes and no. And the reason I say no is actually my photo agent who sells my pictures, who represents pictures, has specifically bans the use of noise reduction software. They say their clients don't like noise reduction pictures, and they if they want to apply noise reduction, they can do after the event. So they will take your picture when they know what size they're going to print it in the book and the magazine. It might need noise reduction. It might not need noise reduction. So in a strange way, it's something that, in that professional capacity as a photographer, I'm not using it. That said, there are times when it makes such a difference to the pictures, and you applying it early on in the process can make such a difference that I do use it. So I do use it sometimes, but not routinely, and that's because I'm not being allowed to use it for that output.
I just interrupt you real quick. I don't really use noise reduction at all. But mostly because I don't shoot at high ISOs at all, but it also just doesn't bother me that much. But why is using it early in the process beneficial?
So noise reduction software has been around for a very long time, but it has become a lot more sophisticated and capable in the last few years. And
we're talking about. Sorry, I assume we're talking about like the AI type stuff or the.
Well, both. But yeah, I mean, as we've said before, everyone attaches the word AI to any software now because it guarantees you twice the sales before anyone's even tried it. So, and how much AI is going on, who knows? But there's definitely, elements of subject recognition in noise reduction, which helps because it means that backgrounds that don't need to have as much detail in can be smoothed more, and detail can be maintained in the subject, and that helps performance. But the two types of noise reduction software that I use the noise reduction in Topaz, which is more of an After Effects use because you need a process file, or generally you're going to run it on a file that's come out of Lightroom already in Topaz. And then there's Lightroom's own noise reduction, which you run on the raw file at an early stage, and it creates a new DNG file in Lightroom as a result. Now, Erin has, I know, who knows far more about processing than I ever will, says that you should run that noise reduction software in Lightroom as one of the first things that you do. It works much better on a pure raw file that has no other adjustments on it than it does if you do all your adjustments and then go, oh, my file's a bit noisy, I should run it now. So I've always followed her advice on that. But I did, on a recent trip, actually, I did find that one of my guests we did night dive photographing the whale sharks at night, and the guest shot with really, really high ISO, very, very noisy file, and actually used the noise reduction at the end of their processing, and their end result was excellent. And like ridiculously so, given how crap the original file was. But the end result was like absolutely stunning shot, super clean, everything. So I continue to follow Erin's advice, which is apply the noise reduction first and then do the rest of my processing. It seems it's quite a logical thing to do. So I do it that way if I do need to use noise reduction. Now, the problem with that is with a lot of pictures, you don't necessarily know you're going to need to use noise reduction because it's actually things like the color correction and exposure corrections that you do on a file that generate the noise. Because what generates noise in a picture is shooting at high ISO, but what generates far more noise than shooting at high ISO is shooting with the wrong exposure and the wrong colors and having to correct those in post, which put loads of noise into a picture that was actually originally pretty clean. And so with that in mind, I often find that I maybe have a picture, go, oh, that one would look good if I rescued it a bit. I rescue it, it creates a lot of noise. And then I go, oh, I should have run noise reduction at the beginning of the process. So what I do at that point is I actually, in Lightroom, copy and paste my settings. So I, go to the development module, go copy settings, select all the settings, go back to the file, reset it back to the original, run the noise reduction, which then creates a very low noise version of the file, and then paste the settings on top of it, which then does all my processing again that I just spent 20 minutes or 5 minutes getting it right. And that's quite a good solution for that. So the Lightroom one, I think, does work incredibly well on some pictures. On most pictures, it really works so much better than any of the early noise reduction sliders in Lightroom, and it's really amazing. Topaz is much more AI. It looks at the subject matters. It clearly knows what a subject is and what background is, and I would say it generally massively overdoes things. And you need to get on Topaz. You need to get all your sliders turned down. Luckily, Topaz allows you to save presets. So I usually, I think I have in Topaz a 25% noise reduction and a 50% noise reduction. And that's 50% of Topaz's normal setting. So they have a slider that's, it doesn't go to 100, but whatever it's set at, I've put it halfway and I've put it a quarter of the way. And then I use those presets in Topaz. But I very rarely use noise reduction, although it sounds like so if I end up with a finished file that's a bit noisy, I might run the Topaz one. And if during Lightroom phase, I look at it and go, oh, that's a bit noisy, or that's too noisy, I might run the Lightroom one. But as a general operating procedure, underwater photography is not that light limited. We're working with strobes. There's plenty of light around. And my photo agent doesn't want me to use noise reduction. So I almost never use noise reduction. But there are some files where I occasionally do, and those are the two I use. There may be better ones out there because, like I say, it's not part of my normal workflow, but those two seem very good, and I'm happy with them. So, yeah.
Cool. All right, on to the next question. This one might be pretty quick. This comes from Dan Vaughn. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. Sad about Sony's new 50-150 not having a macro range. It was almost there for us with internal zoom, but alas, not everything I'd hoped for. I wonder if it could be brought into line with extension tubes. And this is a lens that you and I have discussed, I think, only privately.
On exactly that topic. So
yes,
yeah. So since Dan's brought it up, we better talk about it publicly. So I had the chance to have a play with one the other day, just indoors at a camera event. It's a big sucker. And I think that for me is, I was initially quite hopeful that it could become a macro zoom. It is for me the exact zoom range that I would want for a macro zoom lens. I don't want a 100 to 200 macro zoom. I want a 50 to 150 macro zoom. And so this is potentially quite exciting. There are a few downsides. First of all, the lens is very expensive. So it's not buy it on a whim and try it. You really want to be sure that the thing's going to work before you spend all that money. Or if you buy one for your land photography, if you are a serious land photographer, it is an exceptionally high quality lens. It's a fast lens, which I don't think is that important underwater. It's an f2 lens, right? All the way through the range. But that's not critical in terms, it doesn't help the autofocus on mirrorless cameras in the same way it did with SLRs by providing more light, because the mirrorless cameras tend to focus with the aperture closed anyway. So it's not a deal breaker in that regard. I don't think as an underwater photographer you're going to shoot so much macro at f2 and feel a big advantage over f2.8. So you're buying it really for the image quality and the zoom range, but you're not going to benefit from spending all that money to have an f2 150mm lens, which is what you're paying lots of money for. So I think that makes it a little bit harder to justify. The fact that it's internal zooming is good because it means the barrel length doesn't change inside the port, which makes fitting it in a port good. But it is a big fat sucker, and it's not going to fit in an N100 Nauticam port. So you're going to have to, first of all, put on an N100 to N120 adapter in your Nauticam. And then it may not even fit either because I didn't go so far as to do that. So I think it's about 95mm in width, something like that. So, and I don't remember what the inside diameter of those ports are, but that's something to look at. The zoom ring is also halfway down the lens. So you're not easily going to create a gear for it that'll work off the housings control, because the gear would have to be fat and then get thin again to get through all those adapters. So you're probably going to have some sort of port with the zoom gear knob on the port, which is probably going to end up being a custom section of port, or Nauticam might make a section of port that has a zoom gear on it. But you're going to need that zoom gear somewhere on the port, not on the housing. So that's another issue, and that's before you get to the extension ring issue. The problem of using the extension ring, so I would say the extension ring is a good solution to pull that focus closer. I've not done the calculations to look at what length of extension ring you would need, but the amount of extension ring you need to turn a lens into a macro focusing lens depends on the focal length of the lens. And the wider the lens, the shorter the focal length is. So I think the problem might be at the 50mm lens, you might have a limitation on being able to focus on things far away. And at the 150mm lens, it might not be able to focus closer enough because of having to use the same extension tube all the way through. So those are quite significant problems given the purchase price of the lens and the need for some degree of customization on the port and gear. So it's not a cheap and easy project. So my feeling is that I'm not going to discount it, but I'm not going to do it straight away. I'm going to wait. I think this year we might see some more macro lenses hitting the market. You know, I would love it if Sigma or Sony themselves or someone else, made something in the 120-150 range. That would be great. And I would like to have a little bit more time for them to do that and then spend, then buy all this thing and have to do so much custom work to create something that I don't know how good the final image quality will be. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting area. It's something that maybe in a year or two time I might go, yes, down that line. But I don't think just yet. I know you want to come in on something, Matt.
Well, it'd be interesting because Sony has those power zoom lenses. It'd be interesting if they made this focal range in a lens that doesn't extend. So like the design can stay similar. You don't need to make it f2. You can make like a budget version of that lens, make it f2.8 or 3.5 or something like that. Have it as one of the power zooms, like they're 16-35, and then you don't need to have a crazily designed focus gear or anything, or zoom gear or anything like that. And then ideally, you could have a reasonably sized.
Ask Sony to do all that. You might as well ask them to make it a macro lens too.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I hadn't even got to that yet. And then make it a macro lens as well. So if Sony's watching this, at least humor the two of us and make that lens, please.
Oh yeah. But you only need 2 copies.
Yeah. But then it would be
in this conversation though. We should mention the Tamron lens, because Tamron make
35-150.
Yeah, the 35-150, which the downside of the Tamron is it extends when you zoom it, which makes it trickier to house by quite a bit. But I think if you maybe could approach the Tamron lens, which is cheaper and it's very good quality, the Tamron lens.
Yeah.
And maybe use that and accept that you can't use the whole zoom range. So I used to use in the old days shooting on crop sensor. I used to use a 17-70 Sigma made a 17-70 macro lens, and it was a good mid-range lens, and it focused really close. But I used to use it as an 18-40mm behind a curve port with a close-up diopter on it, and then it became like a wider zooming macro lens. But I couldn't use the full zoom range of the 17-70. But I could use it from between about 18 and 40mm, and basically was bashing into the port at that point. But it was actually quite a useful lens, even though I bought a 17-70 and was only using a section of the zoom. Within that section, it was actually very powerful, and it did give me quite a bit of flexibility on zoom, and it was a wider macro lens than anything else I had, so it was very useful.
So it's interesting you brought that up, because I have 2 things on that. One, our friend Aaron Halstead, he shoots a D850 still, and he shoots the old 70-180 Nikon macro, and he shoots that behind a curved port, and it does extend while zooming. But even with that behind the curved port, it's still way better than it would be behind a flat port, and it gives a really useful zoom range. I mean, obviously, it'd be ideal if it was shifted a bit further on the wider end, but 70 is still pretty good. And then also, I've been shooting the 28-60, the Sony one, the current one, behind a little flat port with Kraken's +6 diopter, and you technically get a zoom. If you use that, you get a zoom macro from like 40 to 60, which can be really useful for larger things. And then you can still shoot, something that's just that size and fill most of the frame with it. And the advantage of having a diopter is it fixes all the weird optical issues. So you have really, really good image quality and a tiny, like 20 millimeter worth of zoom macro capability. Pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think particularly, if you're like both you and I, we both quite like that wider macro about putting animals in their environment and shooting very close to animals, which can, open up some really interesting lighting possibility because you have that ability to wrap your lights around the subject. I think from both those standpoints, these lenses are good. I would also say, though, when you start to get into that discussion, you are beginning, particularly at the wider end, you're running into also what you can do with the EMWL and switching between the optics on the EMWL, which is wider still, but because it's so small, you can deal with smaller subjects with it. So it's important, in all of these grand plans, to not spend loads of money reinventing something that kind of already exists in another form. Yeah. So I would say that, yes, the dream would be to have a 50-150mm macro zoom with excellent image quality, and Sigma's new lens does give that. It's exactly the focal length I would want from a macro zoom. But for the problems that we've suggested, the fact it's big, it's expensive, it's big, it's difficult to house because of the size. You've also got to do a custom zoom gear, probably with some sort of customization of port. That's quite a challenge to take on. And it's definitely going to stay on my radar, but I'm just going to wait this year out because it just feels to me, looking at the market, that macro lenses are overdue. It just feels like, there should be more out there. Sigma used to make those 150s and things like that. I can't believe that someone's not going to want to plug that gap.
Especially Sigma, Sony 90s and 105s, just give us something longer. Or shorter.
Yeah, exactly. So it feels like there's room in the market. Whereas before, when I was interested in adapting things, we had a stable market and you were like, okay, everything's kind of fixed. They've all got their products. This would give me something different. And therefore, I don't mind spending lots of money to go down this route and try something. I think also, I would hope that Sony lens might drop in price a bit in a year or two. There's probably a new lens premium on it at the moment. When there's more of them around and there'll be some on the second-hand market, that's possibly when I might look at going, that would be an interesting thing to buy a second-hand one, mess about with it for a bit, can't get it to work, sell it again second-hand, lose a few hundred, but not lose, you haven't spent ridiculous money to get your hands on it.
All right. Well, we have probably several more as of this moment of these Q&A ones to come.
It's a nice way to deal with topics that we would never think to do an episode on, and also maybe it's a topic that isn't maybe enough for a whole episode. But I think particularly that that last one, it's things that people already will definitely catch some people's attention.
Yeah, and so we do have a couple more questions that we'll have to answer in future episodes, but please, guys, keep sending them through. Put them in the comments. Reach out to Alex or I independently and send your questions through so we can keep doing these ones because these ones are fun, and it's nice to see Alex, or if people send questions to Alex, to see me react on the fly to them without any sort of preparation, although that's kind of how we do the whole show. But thank you. Thank you guys for watching as always, and we will see you on the next episode of the Underwater Photography Show.